Have you started working on your story yet?
No, I'm researching.
Still?
What do you mean still? I only just stopped. Ah!
Ah! Ah!
Research addiction is a real problem that requires real help. Don't let this happen to you. Call 1-800-555-STOP for more information on how to quit excessive research before it's too late. That's 1-800-555-STOP. Get help today.
Welcome to CC Writes. My name is CC Lepke, and today we're talking about how to world build without losing yourself in the research. Every story, even those set in the real world, needs to have a defined setting. That's true even if your setting is only someone's living room or a small town like any other small town in the world. The culture of my living room is going to be different from the culture of my neighbor's living room. Every small town has its own weird little quirks. A good storyteller has to find those quirks and bring them to life. And that is why every author needs to learn solid world building techniques. But that is easier said than done. It's easy to get lost in the details or become overwhelmed by the magnitude of what it means to build an entire world. That's why today's video is looking at where to focus your world building so that you don't end up spinning your wheels. Think of yourself as a literary architect. When an architect designs a building, they need to think about how big it will be, what soil they're putting it on, the people who will use the building, and what their needs are. There are zoning laws, government restrictions, and guidelines for how to build. On a grand scale, an architect considers the overall shape of their work and what artistic elements will fit into the surrounding architecture and cultural preferences. And yet, despite all of these considerations, an architect must be economical with the things that go into their building so that the entire thing doesn't become a money pit. Your story is a building. Your time and energy is money, and you are the architect of an entire world. It's time to learn how to build your story economically. If the idea of world building feels like too big of a task to even start, or if you've dumped all of your time and energy into a money pit of a story, then my advice on how to world build like an architect is just the thing to pull you out of your misery. To build your story like an architect, you need to follow a process that helps to more easily discern what is most needed for your world. You have to define your space, decide on materials, set the foundation, build the structure, and apply the finish. If you follow these steps, you'll be able to build a world that looks and feels rich to the imagination without wallowing in rabbit holes for years on end to no real purpose. Here is how to get it done. You need to set parameters for how long your story is going to be, what specific settings will exist in that space, and what things typically fill those types of settings. Defining a setting is relatively easy when you know the space that your story is meant to inhabit. For example, I wrote a story called Fine, an award-winning story, but you know, whatever. Fine was about a depressed modern teenager who runs away from her home in rural Indiana. You'll notice I defined the major driving plot element, the world where it exists, and even a time period in which it can exist. Once the basic outline of the entire property is established, you define what parts of the property you plan to use for your building. An architect doesn't use every inch of space inside of the property lines. Instead, they create livable space within the boundaries that they've been given. In the same way, you should decide where the actions and events of your story take place. In Fine, there are only a handful of settings within an entire state that I use. My story takes place in a small town, out in the countryside, and in a city. But going even further than that, my characters are typically restricted to specific locations even within those spaces. My specific settings are the main character's house, a bar, a frat party, and a couple of other specific places in her hometown. That means I don't need to have a detailed understanding of all parts of her hometown or the city she ends up in. You only need to know as much as what your characters are able to directly see and care about only the things that your characters care about. With a handful of locations, you can make your world seem expansive without having to actively think about all of the things that make it up. Your materials are the government, family, jobs, religion, politics, art, music, science, technology, or any entity that affects your character or plot. Be fairly broad when picking your materials. Fine was set in the real world in a small town in Indiana based on a place I knew and the state capital where I used to live. The main character had a dysfunctional nuclear family. She was a student. She wasn't religious, but she had a friend who was. She listened to indie pop music, loved video games, art, and theater, and wasn't affected by science, government, or technology, except for the minor things she needed to interact with on a day-to-day basis that were commonplace in her way of thinking. Those are things like going to school, using a crosswalk, using a cell phone. She doesn't really need to know where those things come from. She just knows that she uses them on a regular basis and doesn't even think twice about it. Those were my materials, and they laid the foundation for what I needed to focus on when I did my research. And once you've picked out your materials, you have to make tough but firm decisions on which materials need to be high quality and which materials only have to be builder grade. A high quality material is one that your character is going to interact with or experience a significant amount throughout the story. It needs to be fleshed out as much as possible to ensure that it holds up against scrutiny. For my story, family dysfunction and the aesthetics and culture of the town and the city were high quality materials that I needed to get right in order for it to appear true to life. Builder grade material, on the other hand, is the material that your character doesn't interact with at all or only occasionally. For these materials, you only need to know the minimal amount to make it seem like you know what you're talking about. Builder grade material for my story were government, technology, and science. I mostly had to imply that they existed at the periphery of my main character's awareness, and that's it. Writing, like any form of art, is an illusion. You put in just enough detail that people think that they're looking at a thing, when really it's all just colorful plastic smeared on cloth hanging on a wall. That is my hot take on what a painting is. The foundation of your world resides in the direct versus indirect impact of your materials on the plot. You need to know what's going to have the biggest impact on your story and what has the least impact. For Fine, I had to figure out which things actually affected the plot rather than things that were important to my character. For instance, even though the character went to school and interacted with people there, school didn't affect how the story played out. What did affect the plot, though, were the particular dysfunctions that affected the main character's family, such as drug use, infidelity, and alcoholism. This is the material that made up the foundation of my story, so I had to research thoroughly before I ever started writing. And I'm not telling you to research everything until you've become an expert on the subject. You don't have to write a 100-year history of your world, just like I didn't need to get a degree in psychology before I could write a realistic depiction of someone who suffers from postpartum psychosis. In fact, please don't waste your time writing a detailed history of your world. Even if events centuries before the story starts affect your characters, please don't do that. If it was really that important, you would be writing about what happened back then, not wasting your reader's time summarizing it for them now. Just get to the story. The structure is built when you plot or write out the basic story without any of the bells or whistles. Whether you plot it or just write it is up to you, honestly. Some people can't plot, and some people can't write without a plot. So just get the bare bones story set up so that you have an idea of what the building is going to look like. The structure of your story is built using the high-quality materials that directly impact your story, and you leave all of the other materials for later. Write or plot just enough that you give the general idea of what happens, where people go, and what they do. You're basically making the skeleton of your building. It's going to be lean. You're not worrying about describing things or adding the minute details that make your world feel real. That comes with the next step. Last, but certainly not least, take the remaining materials for your story and research the high-quality materials. As always, focus only on the things that impact your characters or have a bearing on the parts of the world that your characters are likely to pay attention to. You don't need to know that the buildings in the neighborhood your character passes through are done in the Georgian style, or know the entire layout of the homes. You just need to know that they're brick, rectangular, have a lot of windows, and your character used to play in that one as a kid. Ah, memories. It's like putting in the plumbing, the electricity, drywall, paint, fixtures until you're not looking at a construction site, but a fully realized piece of architecture. Or the illusion of one, at least. So what's the most important thing that you need to know about world building? It's all about what your characters experience, think, see, feel, and believe. Reality is only the parts of the world that you personally inhabit. Your reality is different from my reality because our experiences are different. What we notice is different. When you world build, you're putting your main character's reality down on the page, not the whole world, just their little slice of it. So build it to their specifications and don't worry about the rest. At least, not until the sequel. What sort of things do you focus on when you're world building? Tell me about it in the comments. And if you liked my advice on how to world build economically and want to see more from me about writing, check out the video on the top where I talk about how to write conflict in a story. Otherwise, click on the bottom video to see what YouTube recommends. And as always, thank you so much for joining me today on CC Writes. I really hope you enjoyed our time together, and I will see you later.